Good afternoon. I believe that one of the biggest challenges for getting value for money out of your software in a health environment is the challenge of procuring open source software. At the moment, I would posit that most of the people in this hall are paying for software that everybody else in the room has paid for out of a remarkably similar wallet. And it makes huge sense in the health sector to collaborate around open source software using consultants and integrators to implement for you, rather than to repeatedly purchase the same software from off-the-shelf suppliers and system integrators. The big challenge, however, to open source is procuring it. You see, procurement systems are set up to avoid gaming and misbehavior by vendors. They're set up to avoid undue influence. They're set up to protect you from the challenges of the software that you're acquiring, which is a very complex and fragile good. And your procurement systems over the decades have got so good at protecting you from your vendors that when a new model comes along like open source, paradoxically your procurement system works against you. It works to prevent you from being able to adequately and correctly procure open source software. I'm not saying this theoretically. I worked for a company last year helping them get established as an open source supplier, and we repeatedly discovered with the companies that we were supplying that their default terms in their procurement prevented the sale of our software for no reason other than it was forbidden by the procurement system. Not because it was going to be harmful to the company, not because it was going to be bad value for money, but because the procurement rules prevented it. So I'd like to run you through a set of topics that need looking at if you want your procurement to actually be able to procure open source software. You can see here 6 topics. First 5 are a brief summary of an issue with a risk and comparing the proprietary and open source approaches, and the final one about cloud is a little bit different. The first topic is indemnity. When you're dealing with software, one of the things you have to worry about is due to an accident in our copyright and patent systems, you can unexpectedly discover yourself liable for the infringement of copyrights or the infringement of patents. And so traditionally when you're procuring software, you seek protection from those risks. The rights infringements that may exist within software are mainly protectable around copyright. And around copyright, if you're buying proprietary software, the only people who can guarantee you that all of the source code that's got into the software has come from a legitimate source are the proprietary vendor who put it there. And so it's reasonable in your procurement agreements to have punitive terms that seek protection from the negligence of your supplier. But for open source software, that risk is dealt with differently. An open source community consists of many different parties who are all processing software for many different purposes. Those many eyes looking at the software will be running into issues around the software collectively. And rather than needing to force an individual supplier into taking responsibility for the code, the community together will oversee each other's integrity and responsibility for the code. Over the years I've been managing open source for various companies, I've discovered that each open source community has a strong system for ensuring that the copyright that goes into the code is well examined and is well considered. And consequently, you may well discover that indemnity is not something you directly require in procuring open source software. You may well want to seek indemnity from your supplier over their actions, but you'll not want to seek indemnity from any supplier over the overall content of the open source software. If that really is a risk to you, the smartest thing you can do is to go buy an insurance policy, rather than expect your vendor to protect you from those risks. Because all of your vendor will do is either be dishonest and not protect you, and wait until there's litigation for you to find out, or alternatively, they will buy software they will buy insurance from a third party and pass the cost on to you with a markup. You'll find your costs will go down significantly if you don't force your customers to go buy insurance in order to supply you. Warranty is the second question. The purpose of warranty is to protect you from defective work. And again, for proprietary software, the only way that you can get protection from defective work is to get a commitment from the supplier of that work that they will fix any issues that they have caused in the software. But for open source software, there are several different layers. Obviously, your direct suppliers will have to warrant their work, so it's reasonable in your procurement agreement to have terms that require a warranty on work that is performed only for you. But for work that is secured from the community, it is not reasonable for you to ask your suppliers to warrant the work of others. The risk to you of defects in the software is mitigated not by a threat to your supplier, but rather by the mutual interests of the community that are maintaining that community code. Again, if you're not certain that that is sufficient protection from you, then you should purchase a subscription to ongoing maintenance and development work on the code from your supplier. And we'll look at subscriptions a little bit later on. If your procurement mechanism requires warranties and requires warranties of the sort that are applicable to proprietary vendors, you can be fairly sure that either open source vendors will be unable to supply you, or that they will take steps that will be against your interests in excluding things from the scope of the warranty. So check carefully that your procurement is being smart about warranties. Third topic for you is copyright. When you're having work done by a systems integrator or by a contractor, it's very common to ask for the copyright to be assigned to you and for you to closely hold it and keep it proprietary. That's a reasonable thing to do with proprietary software. You have to trust your supplier, particularly with commercial off-the-shelf software. And for systems integrators and for contractors, it's very reasonable for you to acquire and hold all of the copyright. The reason you do this is so that you can ensure ongoing support of the software, so that you can switch contractors, system integrators, or consultants. But with open source software, it's licenses to the open source software that guarantee your liberty in the long term, that guarantee future support. It's not the copyrights. The ownership of the copyright is not really the issue. And you should find that most open source suppliers and contractors are happy to assign you copyright, but will insist that you license that copyright to the open source community under an open source license. It's in your interests to do that. You see, the whole point of open source is that many different parties synchronize a part of their self-interest and collaborate on the overlapping part. That's the whole point of open source. Open source is not something for nothing. Open source is a group of people with overlapping interests collaborating over the parts of their interests that overlap. If you commission software based on an open source project, but retain and closely hold the copyrights yourself, you have just bought yourself a lifetime of maintenance, regression, and ongoing software development work, because you will be the only party that is able to ensure the sustaining and nurture of that code that you commissioned. And you don't want to do that. What you actually want to do is to commission new work, to contribute it to the community, and then have the community do all of the work of sustaining, of integration, of regression as the software matures and goes on forward. Now make sure that your procurement arrangements don't insist that you become the sole closely held owner of copyright when you're working with open source. You'll probably find that a reputable open source supplier will not sign a contract like that, and you could well discover that this legacy term in your contract will prevent procurement. Subscriptions. Many open source software suppliers work on the basis of subscriptions. When you buy a subscription from an open source supplier, what you're buying from them is ongoing delivery of updates, and in many cases access to support and bug fixing and ongoing sustaining of the code. Now if you think about how you get that with proprietary software, you do it in two stages. The first stage you go through in proprietary software is to buy a right to use license. And you spend typically quite a lot of money on a right to use license. And then you'll pay a smaller annual maintenance fee of some sort to your supplier in order to get updates from them, and in order to get the right to pay them a bucket load more money when they, quotes, upgrade the software to a future version. When you use open source software, the structure is different. You may well find the cost is not as low as you think it is, but the cost is restructured and you're put back in control of the transaction. There are no barriers to starting and stopping the use of open source software. Open source software comes under a license that guarantees you the freedom to use the software for any purpose, the freedom to examine the source code and understand how it works, or rather have your consultants and contractors do that. It gives you the freedom to modify it to meet your needs, and it gives you the freedom to pass that code on to any other party around a health trust, around a consortium, around a community. Those rights mean that you are always free to use open source software for any purpose, and there's never a need to pay a license fee. A supplier who claims to be open source but then charges license fees is cheating you somehow. You should ask them what they think they're doing. However, when you're using that open source software, you probably want the benefits that came from the annual maintenance, the cost of which was partly covered by the upfront right to use license. So you could well find that open source subscriptions appear more costly than ongoing maintenance for proprietary software. The reason for that is because the front-loaded payment that's in the right to use license gets included in a reduced version in the subscription payment. But the freedom that you get from that subscription payment is significant. You're always able to stop paying that subscription if your budget is cut. You're able to decide when you turn on and turn off support and subscriptions, and to take the risk against your budget that is involved in doing that. Because obviously if you stop taking a subscription, you stop getting the updates. You stop getting the sustaining to keep the software working as the environment changes. You stop getting the new features that are implemented by that developer. You may well decide that you can hire staff for the same cost as the subscription to do that maintenance yourself in-house. And that's another way you can manage your costs. So when you're looking at procuring software that is based on an open source model, you need to understand that it will not be structured as an upfront right to use fee and then an annual maintenance fee with increments every 18 months to 3 years for a new version. It will instead have a similar but lower cost spread evenly over the entire life cycle of the product. If your procurement arrangement relies on a capital benefit from purchasing licenses, you may well find that it prevents you from buying open source software economically. So you need to understand whether you're claiming capital allowances for the procurement of the right to use. Now, I've worked with a number of companies who've discovered that they can help you in this circumstance if you explain that that is your problem. If you explain that you need to capitalize the cost of a license, they may well be able to structure some of the deal for you as a license that can be treated as a capital expenditure. But it's not the norm, and you need to be upfront about that requirement. Standards. Standards are a good thing. Standards allow you to migrate from supplier to supplier freely, or at least that's the idea behind them. It turns out that not all standards work this way. Some standards turn out to be based on a proprietary vendor's software. Some standards turn out to have a royalty-bearing element within them that makes it difficult for parties who've not been involved in the evolution of the standard to implement. So traditionally, you may well find that your procurement process is looking for open standards in the implementation of the software. But when you're procuring open source software, you need to add an extra requirement onto your procurement process for safety. You need to make sure that the standards that you're specifying are open standards. That is to say, they contain no requirement within the standard to secure permission from a third party before implementation. Standards that you mandate that require a royalty-bearing license or permission from a standard-setting authority or a party will lock open source software out of your procurement environment. And it's important that you weigh the different risks of the different standards that you're specifying. You should also be aware that open standards are actually no protection from lock-in from anybody. Standards can always be extended, and any vendor that believes that they have control over their market will begin to extend standards so that there are elements within the standard that can lock their customers in to a particular supply route. So as you're specifying standards, do it wisely. Just specifying standards does not necessarily buy you the benefit that you were looking for. Finally, let's look at cloud. I haven't structured this in terms of proprietary and open source because the situation is different in the cloud. Cloud computing is simply the timeshare that I entered the industry working on in the 80s, restructured as something delivered over the internet. As somebody said on Twitter this morning, okay geeks, we've got the world calling the internet a cloud, now let's get them to call databases a cylinder. Cloud comes with a set of risks that need mitigating, and open source is your friend in mitigating these risks. First of all, check the terms of service that you're being offered with cloud computing. When you host software yourself within your own data center, it's up to you when there's downtime, or it's up to you to sack the person responsible for unscheduled downtime. But when you're dealing with a cloud supplier, you may well discover that amongst the copious licensing and terms of use, there is a clause that says that they are able to deliver service at their sole discretion, that they may withdraw that for any reason, including intellectual property violations. You may well discover that that service you thought was as solid as rock turns out to be something that can be withdrawn when the political climate changes. So check in your terms of service for sole discretion items that allow withdrawal of service without compensation and without recourse. Check that outages are going to be promptly and more than adequately compensated. And most importantly, check that all the data is actually yours. You can tell it's yours if at any time you can demand delivery of it in full. If in order to secure delivery of it, you're going to have to pay an extra fee, jump through a hoop or sign an extra agreement, then you know the data isn't really yours, no matter how open the data may be. Secondly, for cloud, check for federated solutions. Many cloud solutions are single point of failure, proprietary, single vendor solutions, even if they theoretically use APIs that are implemented by other parties. You need to check that the cloud services you're using are federated and federatable. By that, what I mean is that you can run a local instance of your own if you choose to, or you can choose to have the same instance hosted by a service provider. And at any time that you wish to, you can switch backwards and forwards between the two approaches. And then if messaging is involved, if it's like a social media service or a shared client data service, check that you're able to run your own entry point or node in that arrangement. If the only way to participate in that cloud solution is to go to somebody else's node, then you will always be subject to becoming a victim in that arrangement. So check that the software is federated, check that it's federatable. Cloud does not have to mean single point of failure. Cloud can mean federated software. Federated software is most commonly open source software, because in order to really be able to implement software on your own premises, you should make sure you have all of those 4 freedoms that open source brings you. The right to use, the right to study, the right to modify, and the right to distribute. Those are solid gold to your business. The ability to decide when and where you run the software, the ability to decide who you hire to work on it, the ability to decide how it works in your environment, and the ability to decide who is in your ecosystem are all fundamental strengths of your business that open source delivers. So, to take you back to my list of topics, those are 6 topics that I suggest that you consider in the context of your procurement agreements if you wish to procure open source. You could well discover that your ability to procure open source is severely limited by your procurement processes requirements for the sort of indemnity, warranty, copyright assignment, and deal structuring that arise from 30 years of procuring proprietary software systems. You could well discover that you need to break open that procurement system and create a pathway to procuring open source within the context of it. Finally, I'd like to suggest to you that as you're dealing with open source, you deal with an open source consultant to help you navigate this pathway. It's common for people to say when you're dealing with open source that you should hire a lawyer to help you. That's based on the misunderstanding that open source is purely a licensing issue. Now, I'm the president of the Open Source Initiative, and we are responsible for monitoring which licenses open source software is delivered under. And yet, even in that role, I tell you that open source is not about licenses. Open source is about communities, and open source is about liberties that lie at the root of your business success. If you wish to navigate those communities or navigate those liberties, I strongly recommend that you start with an open source consultant and move on to a lawyer to help you, rather than start with the lawyer because particularly in the UK, lawyers will tend to be unbearably conservative and risk averse, and they will regard open source as a risk that you need protecting from rather than a strength that needs bringing to you. That was everything that I wanted to say to you. We've done that in 20 minutes, and I'd be happy to take a question or two if anyone would like to ask. Best way to ask a question is to come up here, I'm afraid. Come and ask a question, thank you.
Hi. Do you think there are any fundamental differences between the way you manage open source licenses for really generic things like operating systems, browsers, Office packages, for example, and perhaps more specific things like a GP practice solution?
Yes. So yes, I do think there are different stress points of the way that you manage the use of open source at different layers of your solution. You'll be used to buying a proprietary operating system and paying for a right to use and buying a maintenance agreement. Chances are that you have never successfully been able to claim on your maintenance agreement with Microsoft around Windows. It's very unusual for people to actually get bugs fixed by them, and I often wonder why you're paying a fee the whole time for the operating system. However, they engage in that behavior because they've realized that most people never need support on the operating system, or never the sort of support that is worth paying for. And consequently, many people discover when they're dealing with open source as the base layer for a solution that they can defer getting support on it. When it comes to the top layers of the stack, the ones that are actually touching the GP practice or the hospital ward, it's crucially important that you've secured maintenance agreements and subscriptions to guarantee that work. Because with open source software, the whole way that you are able to guarantee service is if you have the skills within your team to deliver that service. Now with proprietary software, the way you get the skills on your team is by buying the proprietary software or engaging the system integrator. With open source software, the way you are able to get the skills on your team is by hiring them, or engaging a system integrator who does open source, or by engaging rolling consultants who will help you with the issues that arise. So I'd say that there is no qualitative difference in the way that you manage open source at the different layers of the solution, but there is definitely a quantitative difference in how much of it you choose to engage. So one more thing to tell you, the Open Source Initiative has recently embarked on a member drive. We've decided to invert the Open Source Initiative and turn it into a member organization. And I'd encourage you, if you are committed to open source software, which I suspect several of you around the stage are, to visit opensource.org and sign up as an individual member of the Open Source Initiative to help us to fund and drive the change that's going to carry open source into the second half of this decade. So that's opensource.org. If you can remember it, it's opensource.org/join. But opensource.org is really the only thing you need to go visit. You had a question?
I'm not sure if it's actually completely misguided, but I would imagine a lot of people are concerned that with open source being open source, it's changing all the time at the base layers. Mm-hmm. So trying to build any system on top of that is very vulnerable because you've got no control of the standards that are being developed at the base layer. Is there any truth in that?
Not really, no. If you look at many open source, substantial open source systems, designate a particular release as a long-term supported release. So for example, Ubuntu Linux specifies a long-term supported version. The last one was, I think, the one from this spring, and that will be supported for several years in the future. So if you're in an environment that wants to go into production, you would prefer the long-term supported release. LibreOffice, the Office Productivity Suite, does the same thing. Maintains a release as a long-term release, and then has got also a more advanced release. Ultimately, if you believe that's a problem, it's open source, so you can choose to freeze the version that you need to work with. It's not like you're dealing with a vendor who is going to take something out of support. The very first version of Linux, when Linus Torvalds was still a student, is still in support if you choose to put it there. So really, I'd say that it's the question you ask arises more from trying to apply proprietary thinking to open source software. So I encourage you to go to opensource.org and sign up as an individual member. Thank you very much. And I encourage you to engage open source consultants. Send me an email if you need a pointer to a consultant who can help you with your tasks. Thank you for your time.